The outer trading post hung in space like a lonely shadow against the cold stars. A cluster of metal corridors and rusted docking bays, hidden far from the busy lanes of the galactic core, and known only to those who traded in things that could not be sold in the open markets of civilized worlds. Ethan had heard about this place many times before, but had never dared to come until now. Not because he feared danger, but because the things sold here often carried consequences that followed a man for the rest of his life. He told himself that he was only here for business, only here to win a rare artifact that could change his future. Yet as his small cargo ship settled into the docking clamps and the heavy airlock doors closed behind him, a strange unease filled his chest. He stepped off the ramp into the main concourse where vendors whispered in secret tongues and cloaked figures slipped by with containers that hummed softly as if alive. There was a constant smell of burnt metal and strange spices in the air, and everywhere he looked, small cameras scanned the crowd, though nobody seemed to care. And Ethan kept his head down and followed the instructions he had been given on the encrypted message earlier that week. He was to find a private chamber at the far end of the trading post, where a special auction would take place, one where the item known only as Lot 47 would be sold. As he walked through the narrow corridors, he wondered again about this mysterious lot. Rumors had traveled across the fringe colonies that it was something ancient and powerful, an alien artifact from a civilization long vanished. Some claimed it could grant unimaginable energy, others that it was a weapon hidden away for centuries. Ethan did not know the truth, but he believed that if he could win the bid, the value of such an item would secure his future forever. He had spent the last of his credits gathering enough money to compete in the auction, and now there was no turning back. When he reached the chamber door, two tall guards in black armor stepped aside wordlessly, their featureless helmets reflecting the pale lights of the corridor. Ethan stepped inside and found himself in a circular room filled with soft shadows and the quiet murmur of serious voices. There were about 20 other people present, most of them wealthy traders, smugglers, or collectors, judging by their expensive coats and confident expressions. The center of the room held a small stage behind a curtain of thick red cloth, and above it a holoscreen displayed the words "Private Auction. Begin soon." Ethan took a seat near the back, careful to remain unnoticed, though he could feel the weight of suspicious eyes turning toward him now and then. A man in a fine coat leaned close to another and whispered something while glancing at Ethan. Then both of them smiled thinly. He ignored them and focused on the stage. He had been to many sales in his life, but never to one that carried such an atmosphere. There was a tension in the air like the moment before a storm, and every person in the room seemed hungry for whatever was about to be revealed. Minutes later, the lights dimmed and the auctioneer stepped onto the stage. A tall man, with a voice like cold steel. He spoke at length about the rarity of the item they were about to witness, how it was one of a kind, how the person who won it would hold power beyond imagination. Ethan's heart beat faster as the auctioneer finally reached the announcement everyone was waiting for. Lot 47, he said slowly, letting the words hang in the air, the most valuable prize ever brought to the station. The curtain lifted. Ethan expected to see some shining relic, a piece of alien technology glowing with strange energy, but what he saw frozen in place. Standing on the stage was a young alien girl with silver blue skin and long dark hair that shimmered faintly under the lights. Her wrists were bound by metal restraints and a collar rested around her neck, but even in chains there was a strength in her posture and a quiet fire in her eyes that made the room go silent. She looked no older than 20 by human standards, but there was an otherworldly quality to her features, a beauty that was both fragile and fierce at the same time. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Some of the bidders leaned forward eagerly while others simply stared in shock. Ethan could not believe what he was seeing. He had thought Lot 47 was an object, a device, a piece of lost technology. Instead it was a living being, a person, who was clearly terrified and trying to hide it behind a mask of defiance. The auctioneer began to speak again, explaining that the girl was the last known survivor of a powerful alien race wiped out in a recent war. She was described as dangerous, yet valuable, capable of abilities that no machine could replicate. Her people, he said, were once worshipped by primitive civilizations because they could draw energy from the very core of the stars. The room listened in silence as he went on, promising that whoever purchased her would not only own a living rarity but perhaps also the key to untold power. Ethan felt sick. He had come here ready to spend every credit he had to buy a priceless artifact, but now he could not ignore the fact that what stood before him was not an artifact at all. She was alive, she was intelligent, and she was being treated like a thing to be sold. His thoughts twisted in confusion as the first bid was called out from somewhere near the front of the room. Another followed quickly, then another, the numbers climbing higher with each voice. The girl's luminous eyes darted from bidder to bidder, and for a moment they met Ethan's gaze. Something passed between them then, something he could not describe but which rooted him to the spot and burned away the last trace of doubt. He realized that if one of these other buyers won, she might be used as a weapon, enslaved, or worse. He clenched his fists and told himself to walk away, that this was none of his business, yet deep inside he already knew he could not. The auctioneer called for higher offers, his voice ringing with greedy excitement. Ethan's heart pounded louder than the murmurs around him. He was here for Lot 47, and Lot 47 now had a face, and that was when he made his choice. The sound of voices filled the room like a restless tide as the bidding for Lot 47 began in earnest, and Ethan sat frozen for a moment, unsure if he should even raise his hand because the numbers being shouted were already higher than anything he had expected. He could feel the heat of greed around him as wealthy traders and collectors leaned forward in their seats, eager to own what they believed was a prize beyond compare. The alien girl stood motionless on the stage with her wrists bound and her expression carefully still, though her bright eyes betrayed a mixture of fear and defiance. Each time the auctioneer announced a higher amount, a muscle in her jaw tightened, but she said nothing and did not look at anyone. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation, because he had prepared for this auction believing he would be buying an artifact, something that could be studied or sold for profit. But now he was faced with a living being, and the thought of leaving her in the hands of one of these buyers made his stomach twist. He remembered the moment when their eyes met and how it felt as if she was silently asking for help, though she had given no sign and spoken no word. He told himself that it was not his responsibility, that he could walk away now, and no one would blame him, yet the idea of her being dragged away in chains haunted him so strongly that he knew he would not be able to forget it. The auctioneer called out a figure so high that it drew gasps from several in the crowd, and Ethan realized that if he was going to act, he would have to do it soon before the bidding reached a level far beyond what he could pay. He lifted his hand slowly and made his first offer. Heads turned toward him with surprise and some with hostility. A heavy man in a gold jacket glared at him and immediately raised the bid higher as if determined to crush the newcomer. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he refused to back down and raised his offer again. The numbers climbed higher and higher, each one a weight in his chest, because he knew he was spending the last of his credits, and perhaps more than he could ever hope to recover. Yet each time he thought about stopping, he looked at the girl on the stage and remembered the fear in her eyes, and he found the strength to keep going. Around him the crowd grew restless because now only 2 or 3 serious bidders remained. The man in the gold jacket muttered angrily as Ethan countered his latest offer, and another woman in a flowing blue cloak joined in her sharp voice, cutting through the noise like a blade. The auctioneer's voice rose with excitement as the bids reached dizzying heights. He praised the courage of the bidders and reminded them that this was a chance that would never come again. Ethan's hands trembled, but he forced himself to stay calm because he could not show weakness, not now. The woman in the blue cloak made a final offer so high that it left Ethan stunned, and for a moment he wondered if he should surrender because he could not go any higher. He felt the eyes of the entire room on him, waiting to see if he would falter. Then he thought about what would happen if she won, and what would happen to the girl who was no longer just Lot 47, but a living person who deserved freedom. He remembered the way she had lifted her head with quiet pride, even while in chains, and something inside him hardened. He stood slowly, his voice steady as he named an amount that was more than he could truly pay, but which left the room in stunned silence. The woman in the blue cloak looked furious, but she did not raise her hand again, and the heavy man in the gold jacket muttered a curse under his breath, knowing he had been defeated. The auctioneer's gavel struck the stage with a loud crack, and he declared Ethan the winner. The room erupted in low murmurs, some of disbelief, others of anger and resentment. Ethan sat down heavily, his heart pounding, because he knew he had just made powerful enemies. He could feel their stares like knives against his back, and he knew that they would not forget what had happened here tonight too. Guards stepped onto the stage and unfastened the girl's chains before leading her down the steps toward Ethan. She moved gracefully despite the weight of the restraints, and when she reached him, the guards shoved her forward with little care. Ethan steadied her, and for the first time spoke to her, softly telling her that he would not harm her. She stared at him with an unreadable expression, her luminous eyes scanning his face as if trying to decide whether he was telling the truth. She said nothing and allowed herself to be guided out of the auction chamber, but her silence felt heavy like a wall between them. As they left, Ethan could hear the voices of the losing bidders behind him, their anger barely contained. One of them muttered that the girl should never have been sold to an outsider, and another swore that they would take her back by force if necessary. Ethan did not look back because he knew that any show of fear would only encourage them. Instead, he kept his hand lightly on the girl's shoulder and walked quickly through the corridors of the trading post toward the docking bay where his small cargo ship waited. When they reached the ship's ramp, he paused and glanced at the girl once more. She had said nothing since leaving the auction, but her eyes were filled with questions and a flicker of distrust. He could not blame her because to her, he was just another man who had bought her like property. Ethan sighed and told her quietly that he had no intention of keeping her captive, and that as soon as he could find a safe place, he would release her. She tilted her head slightly as if considering his words but remained silent. Ethan guided her up the ramp and into the cargo bay, which was small and lined with metal crates, filled with the few supplies he owned. He closed the hatch behind them, and for a moment allowed himself to breathe, because at least now they were away from the eyes of the other bidders. But his relief was short-lived, because he knew that they would not give up so easily. He had seen the greed and anger in their faces and understood that some of them might try to take back what he had won. He led the girl to a small cabin near the front of the ship and told her she could stay there for now. She still did not speak, but there was a trace of curiosity in her expression as she looked around the cabin's simple furnishings. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what else to say, before telling her that his name was Ethan and that she could rest if she wished. She gave the smallest nod and sat down on the narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap. Ethan left the cabin and walked to the cockpit, where he sat heavily in the pilot's chair and started the launch sequence. The engines rumbled to life and the ship lifted slowly from the docking bay floor, rising toward the stars beyond. He knew that he had crossed a line tonight, one that could not be undone. He had no idea what awaited him now, but he understood one thing clearly. The girl in the cabin was not an artifact or a prize. She was someone whose fate was now tied to his, and whether he liked it or not, he would have to protect her. As the cargo ship slipped free of the trading post and into the vast dark of space, Ethan felt a chill of unease. Somewhere behind him in the endless black, he knew the people he had outbid were already planning how to take her back. The cargo ship drifted through the vast ocean of space, leaving behind the trading post that now felt like a nest of vipers, and Ethan kept his hands tight on the controls as he guided the vessel away from the nearest shipping lanes because he knew they would be followed. He could almost feel the presence of unseen eyes tracking him from afar, and every small sound from the ship's engine made him turn his head as though expecting an attack. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different because now he was not only responsible for himself, but for the alien girl, resting quietly in the small cabin behind him. He thought of her often during the first hours of flight, wondering what was going through her mind, and whether she would try to escape. He did not even know her name yet, and the memory of her bright eyes watching him in silence unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She had every reason to distrust him because, after all, she had been sold to him like property, even if he had no intention of keeping her that way. Ethan told himself that he would release her as soon as they reached a place of safety, but he had no idea where such a place might be. Several hours later, he decided it was time to check on her, so he left the cockpit and walked slowly down the narrow passageway until he reached the cabin door. He knocked lightly, and when there was no response, he opened the door carefully. The girl was sitting on the bed with her back straight, and her hands folded in her lap, just as he had left her. And when her luminous eyes lifted to meet his, he felt a strange pull in his chest. There was strength in those eyes, but also exhaustion, and a quiet sorrow that spoke of more suffering than he could imagine. Ethan stepped inside and told her softly that they were clear of the station for now, though he could not promise how long that would last. She remained silent for a long moment, before finally speaking in a voice that was soft, yet carried a quiet authority. She told him her name was Lyra. The sound of it struck him like music, and he repeated it under his breath, as if to commit it to memory. Lyra watched him with a guarded expression and asked why he had bought her. Ethan hesitated before telling her the truth, that he had not gone to the auction expecting to buy a person, but that he could not stand the thought of leaving her to the others. Lyra listened carefully, though her face betrayed little, and she asked him what he planned to do with her now. Ethan explained that he had no plan beyond getting her to safety and freeing her, because he believed that no one should be owned. He admitted that this decision might cost him his life, because the people he had outbid were dangerous and would likely come after him. For the first time, he saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, as though she could not understand why a human would risk so much for someone he did not know. She asked if he wanted anything in return, and Ethan shook his head quickly because the thought of using her made him sick. He told her that she was free to go wherever she wanted once they reached a safe world, but until then, they needed to work together. Lyra studied him for a long moment, and then nodded slowly, though he could tell she still did not fully trust him. That was fine, he thought, because trust was not something that could be given easily, not after what she had endured. They spent the next day in tense silence as the ship continued through the empty reaches of space. Ethan checked the sensors constantly, because he was certain they would be hunted, but so far the screens showed nothing. He knew it was only a matter of time before the others found them. During those quiet hours, he began to notice small things about Lyra. She moved with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, and when she touched the walls of the ship, the faint glow of her skin left a shimmer behind like stardust. Once he caught her staring out the window at the stars, with a look of longing so deep it made his heart ache. Later that night, he found her in the cargo bay standing near the crates, and he asked if she was looking for something. She shook her head and told him she was only trying to feel the flow of energy around the ship. Ethan frowned in confusion, so she explained that her people had a connection to the energy of the universe, a gift that allowed them to draw strength from the stars themselves. She said the long time in captivity had weakened her, and she needed to recover slowly. Ethan nodded in understanding, though part of him wondered Just how powerful she could be if she regained her full strength. As they talked, Lyra's voice softened, and for the first time he saw the walls around her begin to lower. She told him a little about her homeworld, a lush and beautiful planet that had been destroyed in the war. She was captured while trying to protect the last of her people, and now she believed that she might be the only one left alive. Ethan listened, quietly feeling a heavy sadness for her, because he could not imagine the pain of losing everything. He promised her that he would do everything he could to help her find any survivors, though he knew the chances were slim. Before she could answer, an alarm blared from the cockpit, making Ethan's blood run cold. He rushed forward with Lyra close behind and saw that the ship's sensors were flashing red. 2 small vessels had appeared behind them, closing the distance quickly. Ethan cursed under his breath because he knew exactly who it was. The other bidders had found him, and they were not wasting any time. He pushed the engines to full power, and the cargo ship shuddered as it leapt forward, but the pursuing ships were faster and began to gain on them. Lyra stood at his side, gripping the back of the pilot's chair, as she asked what they could do. Ethan scanned the nav system and saw a dense asteroid field ahead. It was dangerous to enter, but staying in open space meant certain capture. He told her to hold on and steered the ship straight toward the field. The rocks loomed larger and larger until they filled the view, and then the cargo ship slipped between them, weaving desperately through the narrow gaps. The pursuers followed, firing bursts of energy that lit up the darkness behind them. One blast struck close enough to make the ship shake violently, and alarms screamed in the cockpit, but Ethan held his focus as he twisted and rolled through the asteroids. Lyra placed a glowing hand on the control panel, and suddenly the ship felt lighter, faster, as if some invisible force was helping them. Ethan glanced at her in surprise, and she explained that she was using what little energy she could to protect the ship. He nodded in gratitude and pushed harder. For several long minutes they danced through the deadly maze until finally the sensors showed. The pursuing ships had lost track of them and fallen back. When they were certain they were safe, Ethan slowed the ship and allowed himself a shaky breath. He turned to Lyra, who looked pale from the effort, but still stood tall. He thanked her for helping, and she nodded quietly before saying that she could not hold on much longer without rest. He guided her back to the cabin and told her to sleep, promising that he would watch the sensors through the night. As she lay down, he saw the faint shimmer of light fade from her skin and realized how close she was to exhaustion. Ethan returned to the cockpit and stared out at the distant stars, wondering how long they could keep running. He had saved her from the auction, but now they were both marked and the hunters would not stop. Still, when he thought of the way she had stood beside him in the cockpit, trusting him enough to fight for their survival, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe they could make it through this together. The cold silence of space was not peaceful anymore. It was a warning hanging all around them like a web ready to tighten, and Ethan felt it in the air of his ship in the way. The walls seemed to listen in the way each beep from the sensor screen made his heart beat harder. He had not slept in 2 days, not properly, because the moment he closed his eyes he saw flashes of energy fire and shadowy ships chasing him, and the memory of that auction room never left his mind, especially the way the crowd looked at Lyra like she was a treasure or a weapon, but never a person. She remained quiet most of the time, resting in the cabin, only coming out for short moments, and when she walked there was a grace about her that seemed more natural now, as if she was beginning to heal from the pain of captivity. Her movements smoother, her eyes brighter, though there was still a shadow inside them. Ethan noticed how she always kept one corner of her vision on the exits, how her hands never fully relaxed, and he understood that kind of fear because he had known people who never escaped it, even years after the danger was gone. One morning, or what passed for morning, inside a ship drifting far from any star, Ethan brought her something warm to eat and sat across from her as she slowly finished. And for the first time she asked him something that surprised him. She wanted to know why he lived in space alone, why he traveled so far from human colonies. and why he came to a place like that auction when he clearly had no hunger for the power that others chased. He took a moment to answer, not because he was hiding, but because he had not been asked that in a long time. He told her about the past, how he had once worked for a trade guild, how he had trusted the wrong people, and been betrayed, left with debts and no allies. He explained that space was the only place where he felt free, where no one told him who he had to be, and where each new job was a chance to build something of his own. He admitted that he had made mistakes, that he had walked away from things he should have fought for, but saving her was something he could not walk away from, and that even if it cost him everything, he did not regret the choice. Lyra watched him as he spoke, her eyes thoughtful, and after a long silence she said that she believed him, and that he was different from the others who had tried to buy her that day. Ethan felt something shift between them, something small but real, like a first light in a long dark tunnel he did not reach for her hand or make any grand statement. He only nodded and stood to return to the cockpit, but her voice stopped him at the door. She said that her strength was returning slowly, and that if danger came again, she would not hide. Those words stayed with him for hours as he watched the sensor screen, because they were not just a promise of help. They were a sign of trust, a step forward that could not be forced or faked. Later that day, the warning system went off and Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach. He leaned forward and saw the blinking red symbols, 2 ships approaching fast from behind, same class as the ones from before. He cursed softly under his breath and activated the engines, pushing the ship into a sharp arc away from their course. The hum of the engine rose around him, and within seconds, Lyra entered the cockpit, already sensing the shift in the ship's motion. "They are back," she said calmly, and he nodded, trying not to let the panic rise in his throat. "They must have tracked us somehow, maybe left a tracer on the hull, or maybe they had informants in the black market networks. Either way, they were gaining fast, and there was no asteroid field this time, no place to hide, only open space and a dead moon ahead." Ethan pointed at the moon and said they could try to land behind the craters, use the surface to mask their heat signatures for a few hours. Maybe it would buy them time or confuse the pursuers enough to lose them. Lyra agreed without hesitation and began preparing to assist. She stood near the control panel and once again placed her hand on the metal surface. The ship reacted instantly, lights flickering slightly as her presence pulsed through the systems. They landed hard, the ship bouncing slightly as it touched the uneven rock of the dead moon, dust clouds rising around them, but they made it down without damage, and Ethan quickly powered down the engines, setting all systems to minimum, while Lyra watched through the viewport, her expression unreadable. The other ships appeared moments later, searching from above, scanning the surface and sending low-frequency pulses across the terrain. For over an hour, Ethan and Lyra sat in silence, listening to the hum of the moon and the distant rumble of searching ships, until finally the enemy vessels turned away, disappearing into the void once more. Ethan let out a long breath and turned to thank Lyra, but she was already walking back to the main room of the ship, her steps steady. He followed her and found her standing in the center of the ship near the cargo crates, her eyes closed and her hands raised slightly above her waist. A soft glow began to rise from her skin, golden and blue, mixed like fire and sky. Ethan did not speak, afraid to interrupt whatever she was doing. Then the light spread around her, forming patterns in the air, shapes that moved like waves around a star. She opened her eyes and said quietly that it was time he knew the truth. She told him about her people, how they were once guardians of star energy, how they had not created weapons, but balance machines, built to protect living systems from collapse. How those machines had been stolen and used to destroy, how her race had been hunted, not because they were powerful, but because they stood in the way of those who wanted to control the universe. Ethan listened without interrupting, the pieces falling together like stars aligning. He asked her if she still had the ability to create such energy, and she nodded slowly, saying that she could, but only when she was at full strength, and even then, it would take a heavy cost. She explained that the energy was not endless, that each time she used it, a part of her life was given in return. Ethan looked at Her in silence, knowing now why the others had wanted her, why they would never stop chasing her, and why she could never return to a normal life. He told her that whatever she chose to do from here, he would stand with her, that she did not have to face any of it alone, and that even if they had to run forever, he would not leave her behind. She turned to him, then her expression soft for the first time. Not guarded, not distant, but open and full of something deep and quiet. They spent the rest of the night making a plan, not just to escape, but to survive and maybe even find the others like her, if any still lived. The moon was quiet and cold, but inside the ship something warm had begun to grow, not just between them, but in the air itself. A bond that had been forged not by chance, but by choice. Ethan woke to the alarm blaring through the small cockpit, and for a moment, he thought it was another dream, but the sharp sound was real, and it sent a chill down his spine as he threw himself into the pilot's chair, the sensor screen flashing red, showing that they had been found again. Two ships closing in fast from behind, and a larger vessel moving to cut them off from the front. He knew immediately that these were the same hunters from the auction, and they were done playing games now, because the way they moved showed clear precision. They were ready to capture or kill. Lyra appeared behind him, her face pale, but her eyes glowing brighter than he had ever seen, as she asked him how close they were. Ethan told her they had minutes at best, and he did not know if the ship could outrun them this time. The engines were already pushed beyond their limit from the last escape, and his hands trembled slightly on the controls. But he refused to let it show, because she was watching, and he could not let her see fear. She placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that they could not keep running forever. They had to make a stand. He looked at her, not sure what she meant, until she moved past him into the narrow passageway leading to the cargo bay. He called out for her to stop, but she ignored him, saying that her strength was returning, and that if they did not fight now, they would never be free. Ethan swore under his breath and followed her, because he would not let her face this alone in the cargo bay. Lyra stood tall, her silver blue skin shimmering faintly as she raised her hands and closed her eyes. Ethan had no idea what she was doing, but he felt the air change as a low hum filled the space like the vibration of distant thunder. She told him to fly straight and not to hesitate. When the moment came, Ethan hurried back to the cockpit and gripped the controls. The hunters were close now, so close he could see their sleek forms through the rear cameras, energy weapons charging up and locking onto his ship. Then he felt it, a surge of power flowing through the hull, like the ship itself had come alive, and he realized Lyra was channeling her energy into the systems, giving them a speed and strength they had never known before. The engines roared louder, and the vessel leapt forward. Dodging the first blasts of enemy fire, Ethan steered through the empty void, weaving and rolling as the hunters fired again. But now each movement was sharper, faster, as if the ship obeyed his thoughts rather than his hands. Larger vessel ahead launched a net of energy meant to trap them. Ethan saw it too late and swore, thinking it was over, but Lyra's voice echoed through the ship, telling him to hold steady. The glow around the hull brightened blinding white, and at the last second they shot straight through the net, tearing it apart like paper. Alarms screamed on the enemy ships as they tried to adjust, but Ethan was not giving them the chance. He banked hard toward a narrow gap between two massive asteroids. Forcing their pursuers to follow, the asteroid field was dense and dangerous, fragments spinning in every direction, large boulders colliding in slow, deadly dances. But Ethan had no choice. He pushed deeper into the maze, each turn inches from disaster. Lyra's power kept the ship steady, while his instincts guided them between walls of rock behind them. One of the smaller hunters clipped an asteroid and exploded in a flash of fire that lit the field like a small star, but the larger vessel was still there, relentless and closing fast. Ethan knew they could not outfly it forever. He opened a channel and told Lyra they had one chance. He had spotted a narrow canyon inside a huge asteroid, and if they could lure the big ship inside, they might trap it. He felt her energy pulse in agreement, and he dove toward the canyon walls, scraping past jagged stone as the enemy followed, determined to finish them once and for all at the deepest point. Ethan spun the ship around and faced the charging vessel head-on. It was a move that made no sense, and for a second, the enemy hesitated. That was the moment Lyra unleashed everything. The ship glowed brighter than the stars around it, and a shockwave erupted from its hull, slamming into the canyon walls. The rock shattered, collapsing inward and crushing the larger vessel. In an avalanche of stone and fire, Ethan fought the controls as debris slammed into his ship, but somehow, they burst free of the canyon and into open space, leaving nothing behind but silence and drifting fragments. He let out a shaky breath and powered down the engines, letting the ship drift while he hurried to the cargo bay. Lyra was on her knees, her hands still faintly glowing, but she was smiling, though it was faint and tired. She told him it was over, that they were finally safe. Ethan helped her to her feet and carried her gently to the cabin where she could rest. He stayed by her side until her breathing steadied and she finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. The next day, he set course for a world Lyra had whispered about before, a hidden refuge where she believed a few survivors of her people might still live. It took them 3 long days to reach the remote star system, but when they did, Ethan saw a lush green planet shining like an emerald in the darkness, and as they descended through its atmosphere, he saw figures waiting for them on a wide-open plain. Lyra woke as the ship landed, and when she stepped outside, the other survivors ran to her with tears in their eyes, embracing her as though welcoming home a sister long lost. Ethan stood at a distance, watching the reunion, and feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He had done what he promised. He had brought her home, and now she was free. One of the elders of her people approached and thanked him with quiet dignity, offering him sanctuary among them. But he shook his head because he knew this was their place, not his. Lyra walked up to him then, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. She simply placed a small glowing crystal into his hand and said that it was a token of gratitude and a sign that their bond would always remain. Ethan smiled and told her to stay safe, and she smiled back, her luminous eyes shining with something more than simple thanks. As he returned to his ship, he felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. As he lifted off and broke through the planet's atmosphere, the token in his hand seemed to pulse gently with light, as though carrying a part of her with him. He looked out at the endless stars ahead, and for the first time in a long time he did not feel alone. He knew the hunters were gone, and that Lyra's people were safe, but more than that, he understood that a single choice made in an auction room had changed both of their lives forever, and perhaps one day their paths would cross again. Until then, Ethan would keep flying, carrying the quiet hope that maybe he had not only saved a life, but found a reason to believe in something greater. And with that thought, he guided his ship into the deep unknown of space, ready for whatever waited beyond the next star. The end.